Edit.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Professor Eric Lindsay, and in this video we're going to start to learn how to connect chords in the manner of a classical composer. This technique is known as voice leading, which is the technique of smoothly connecting the individual music lines within a musical texture. Classical composers thought of harmony as the result of multiple independent melodic lines. So we're going to call it voice leading because it involves creating harmonies by weaving together melodies. This is different from like coming up with a chord progression first and then writing a melody that fits with it. Instead, we're learning the rules of how independent melodic lines combine with others to form harmony. So we'll be referring to each line of the texture as a voice. And importantly, we're not only talking about choral music, it doesn't necessarily involve singing. Each voice is just the lines that we're following. We are going to have soprano, alto, and tenor being mostly smooth and stepwise between chords. We'll see basses leap around a lot more since the root motion will involve more skips. And in all voices, we're avoiding augmented intervals, leaps larger than a third ascending to a leading tone. We're avoiding leaps of a seventh, and leaps greater than an octave. So when analyzing voice leading, we're looking at a couple things. One, the intervallic content within a chord, such as the location of perfect fifths and octaves, as well as the direction of melodic motion within each voice between chords. Let's analyze these last two chords for a starting point. So we're going to have to look vertically at what is each pairing of voices between soprano, alto, soprano, tenor, soprano, bass, and as well as the inner voices to see what is their vertical interval as well as how do they move to the next chord. So for starters, let's look at the soprano and the alto. We started off with a sixth between soprano and alto and then moving to a fifth. This alto stayed stationary, the soprano moved inward. When one voice stays stationary where the other one moves up or down, that is oblique motion. Let's take a look at what the soprano and the tenor are doing. We start off with an E in the soprano, a third beneath, a compound third, to a tenor moving down by step and soprano moving down by step, also a third. So we moved from a third to a third in the same direction. This is called parallel motion. A variant of this idea is similar motion, which is what occurs when two voices move in the same direction but by different sizes. So if a B leapt up a fourth to an E, and in another voice an E went up a third to a G in the same direction, even if these aren't the same interval size, this is called similar motion. The next pairing is soprano moving from E to D, while the bass, starting on C, moved up to G in the opposite direction. Down by step with the soprano from a third up to a fifth with the bass jumping up to that G. This is called contrary motion, where we went downwards in one voice and up in the other voice. Looking at the tenor and the alto's relationship. Alto being stationary and the tenor moving away from a fifth to a sixth. This is again oblique motion because the alto remained stationary. The relationship of the bass to the alto, again, is a oblique motion where we went from a perfect fifth to a perfect octave. And then finally, the relationship of our tenor to our bass involves an octave between tenor and bass moving to a third in opposite motion. This is contrary motion. Remember that the effort we're trying to do here is to create or to observe the movement of two or more voices interweaving. And to make a distinct voice, we want them to have some independence in terms of line. So that means that they are going to move, each voice is going to have a range of melodic motion types that we just described in the previous part of the video. And the relationship between them, between voices, we also want to have a range of intervals. Because just like a soprano and an alto moving constantly in thirds or in sixths doesn't necessarily mean independence of line. So if the general rule of ensuring that each voice has a distinct melodic contour and making sure we aren't relying too heavily on the same interval between two voices for more than, let's say, three notes in a row. We don't want to have more than parallel thirds or parallel sixths between voices for more than three because that'll counteract the independence of the voices. The other main rules for voice leading to ensure that we're maintaining voice independence has to do with how do we approach perfect intervals and how do we approach and resolve tendency tones such as the leading tones and chordal sevenths. So let's start off with the rules around parallel octaves and fifths. You may have heard about parallel octaves and fifths being the worst thing ever. A parallel interval, such as a fifth, an octave, or a unison, we can never approach these intervals in parallel motion because this is going to definitely counteract the independence of voices. So when you're analyzing chords for voice leading issues, you have to apply all the same lenses that we applied at the beginning of this video. We're looking for relationships between all pairings of voices. So looking through here, is anyone in parallel motion? Boosh. We have the bass and the alto in parallel, problematic parallel eighths. What about if we had another triad? This is the 4 chord moving to a 5 chord in the key of E flat. Any other problematic parallels? There we go, between our tenor and bass, we've got some parallel fifth action. Trust me, it gets faster with time the more you do this. Now, the other thing is, instead of just pointing out voice leading issues, let's find ways to solve the problem. So if we were going from a 1/6 to a 5 chord, I would start to think about, what are the other notes of my 5 chord, and then move in contrary motion as much as possible. So my soprano can go down while the alto goes up to avoid that parallel octave. And then same thing on the second example. We have parallels between alto and bass. What if I just made my alto go down instead, ensuring that I'm using all of the 3 notes from the same chord I was trying to outline? That was our dominant chord. And then this last example, similarly, a 4 chord to a 5 chord is begging for accidental parallel motion. So if we made all of our upper voices go down instead, we could confidently say that we're avoiding parallel motion. Now, we can move from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth, since this doesn't entail approaching a perfect interval in parallel motion. But on the other hand, we can't do this in vice versa. We can't approach a perfect interval in parallel motion. Now, for tendency tone considerations, the general rule is that leading tones always need to resolve up by step. That satisfaction of the leading tone resolving upwards to the tonic is one of the most satisfying and emotionally driving aspects of tonal music. When we have that leading tone thwarted, it sounds rather disappointing. Now, we can thwart the resolution of a leading tone. We don't need for the leading tone to resolve up by step if it's subsumed within an inner voice. That'll be much less obvious. And our chordal sevenths, like the 7th of our dominant chord, so if we're looking at the dominant chord in a key, that's, so, ti, re, fa. That fa needs to resolve down to mi, regardless of where it appears. So let's also return to that notion of similar motion. Remember, similar motion is 2 voices moving in the same direction, but is not by the same amount. So in this case, we have a soprano going up to a D, and a bass going from C sharp to D. So this is going to result in similar motion towards a perfect octave. When this occurs, as a soprano approaches a perfect octave or a fifth approached by leap, it's going to result in what we call a similar or direct octave, or a similar or direct fifth. Both of these are a no-no. Now, it's important to keep track that the rule of similar motion is only applying to outer voices. If it happens in an inner voice, it's going to be subsumed within the texture. We won't really notice, and it's considered acceptable to find similar motion towards fifth or octaves in an inner voice, or between an outer voice and an inner voice. Now, the only time we can have similar motion within an outer voice is if the soprano moves by step. So a lot of times you'll see at the end of a phrase a 5 chord moving to a 1 chord. We will have scale degree 5 moving to 1 in the bass by leap. And if we have scale degree 7, the leading tone, going up by step to 1, and that's in the soprano, that is acceptable. Moving up to a similar motion in perfect octaves, to a perfect octave via similar motion is acceptable in outer voices if you move by step. And then finally, we're not going to approach octaves in similar motion from a dissonant interval, such as a 7th or a 2nd. It's just considered ugly. So in closing, track these guidelines for voice leading whenever we're writing 4-part harmony. Number 1, types of motion between the intervals. So, intervals between pairs of voices may be approached by contrary, parallel, similar, oblique, or stationary motion. 2, we're not going to approach a perfect interval in parallel motion between voices, anywhere in the texture. Number 3, a leading tone in an outer voice must resolve up to the tonic. We can break that rule if it's in an inner voice. Number 4, chordal sevenths, always resolve them down by step. And number 5, we're not going to approach an octave in similar motion between outer voices unless the soprano moves up by step. And we're not going to approach a unison from similar motion, and we're not going to lead from dissonance to an octave in similar motion. So in our next video, we'll talk more about harmonic progressions and harmonizing melodies, which is one of my favorite aspects of fundamental theory. I look forward to seeing you there.